Hello, I would like to tell you some stories today. Back in 1967, a new TV show, Dragnet, used this opening. The story you are about to see is true. The names have been changed to protect the innocent. My stories are also true, and I do not name any names either. Since this is a police story, I need to get changed. There, now I look more like what you would expect. These stories are about some of the stupid things people do under the influence of alcohol, especially while driving. So let's get started. One night, after the sun had gone down, I started patrolling up a mountain road. It was near the bottom of the canyon where the road had slow, twisty curves. As I came around a corner, I could see a car stopped in the middle of the road. Its lights were on. All four of its doors were open, and the driver was standing on the roof of the car. I stopped, got out of my car, walked over, and looked up at him. I asked him what was wrong. He replied, "There's a skunk in my car." I looked and smelled inside the car. No skunk smell, and believe me, that is one smell you can't miss. I could smell something, but it wasn't skunk. It was alcoholic beverage, so I arrested him for drunk driving. The next story also happened in the evening when the sun had gone down. My shift was almost over, and I had reports to complete before I could go home. I pulled off the road onto a gravel rest area on the summit of a canyon road. I turned on my blinking yellow lights on my patrol car light bar and began to finish my paperwork for the day. A short while later, a car came up the canyon and drove off the road and stopped behind me. His headlights stayed on. I expected the driver wanted to talk to me or something. But as I watched in my mirror, nobody approached my car. I got nervous about the situation because I couldn't tell if anyone had even gotten out of the car. I got out and carefully walked back to the car. I tapped on the driver's window and he rolled it down. I asked him if he needed something. And he said, "Just waiting for the light, officer," in a slurred voice. Now you need to know that the small county where I was working had no traffic lights anywhere in the county. Even now, as I tell this story, the whole county only has one traffic light. So, based on the fact that he believed my overheads were traffic lights, and he had to drive off the road to wait behind me, I arrested him for drunk driving. Of course, what I have not told you is that when possible, I always had drivers perform the typical agility test, noted their speech patterns, and smelled for alcohol on them or in the car. There's usually some type of alcoholic beverage container in their vehicle as well. After being trained, I started using a horizontal gaze nystagmus test. It involves putting an object, usually my pen, about a foot from their face and then moving it from side to side. They are told to watch the pen without turning their head. I watch the driver's eyes. Alcohol can cause erratic, jerky movement in the eyes before the pen gets past a 45-degree position. This next story occurred while my wife and I were driving in a large city after dark and in our personal car. I was off duty. We were in a 25 or 30 mile an hour zone and coming up on a stoplight. We passed a pickup truck going slowly, and I noticed it didn't have its lights on. I commented to my wife that the driver was showing some classic signs of DUI, meaning the slow speed and no headlights. We turned into a left turn lane and stopped for the light. The truck also turned into the left turn lane and slowly rolled into the rear of my car. I told my wife to call the police on her cell phone, and I went back to talk to the driver. He was just sitting in the truck as though nothing had happened. I opened his truck's door. As I talked to him, I could smell an alcoholic beverage odor, and he seemed disoriented and didn't realize what he had done. I reached in and took his keys and waited for the police. When they arrived, I showed them my ID, gave them the keys, and explained what had happened. After finishing some paperwork, we left, assuming the driver would be arrested. A few days later, a man called me and said he was the driver's boss, and he also owned the pickup truck. He asked if he could pay for the minor damages to my vehicle instead of filing a claim with his insurance company. I agreed, and he sent me a check. This next story took place during the winter. I was driving down a canyon road during a winter night. The roads were plowed and drivable, but there were snowbanks on the roadside. I saw a car that had slid off onto the side of the road and up against the snowbank, but it didn't appear to be stuck or high-centered or anything, and looked like the driver could get back onto the pavement. There were exhaust fumes visible in the cold air, so I knew the engine was running, and I could see someone was in the car, so I stopped to see if they needed assistance. As I walked up to the window, I could see the driver better. He was holding on to his steering wheel, rocking back and forth in his seat, and making engine roaring noises with his mouth. I looked at his rear wheels and could see that they weren't moving at all. The car wasn't even in gear. After opening the door, I could smell and see he was plastered. I arrested him for drunk driving. This next story shows the real danger of drinking and driving, even if it isn't on the highway. I was awakened early one morning in June of 1977 by a young man pounding on our door. He said his friend had rolled their vehicle in the nearby hills and needed help. When we arrived, I found two more young men, one of whom was dead. The truck was lying on its side on the mountain road. There were beer cans on the ground and in the truck. The investigation showed that the three young men had been drinking while driving on the mountain roads. The truck was going too fast for a turn and rolled. The right side passenger was ejected and then crushed by the truck as it rolled onto its side. The driver, who was 17, was charged with negligent homicide in juvenile court. This was not the first time I have experienced the roll and then crush a vehicle can do. I investigated a few other accidents that were similar. What happens is that as the car starts to roll, it propels the person up and out of their seat, and sometimes only partially out the window. Often the force of it will even break the window out. Most of the time the person is thrown free of the vehicle, but sometimes only the upper body comes out and the rolling vehicle crushes it. On a couple of times I've had to pick up the human parts that squirted out when the head was crushed. I am thinking of one in which a four-wheel drive vehicle driven by a young man was climbing up a steep hill above a gravel pit. He tried to turn sideways, but it was too steep, and he rolled down into the gravel pit. That particular accident was early in my career, and where I learned that the police department had a policy about notification of death to a family, which I very much appreciated. It's never a pretty picture, and I apologize if I have offended your sensitivities. So please learn to always wear a seatbelt and never drink and drive. These stories show how alcohol can make people do stupid things. Thank you for your time.